So if you want to just zoom way, way out and dumb it really down, insulin resistance is from overfilled fat cells, and you overfilled your fat cells because you were eating carbohydrates and fat at the same time. Glucose always controls oxidation preference in your cells. So if glucose is present from the outside, you will oxidize less fat. So exogenous glucose coming in from the outside shuts off fat oxidation. If you're eating fat at the same time, it all gets stored. So you just eat carbs and fat together like a donut all day, every day. You burn glucose all the time, you store fat all the time, your adipocytes fill up, bam, you've got hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. It's really that simple.
Oh my gosh, Deanna, this pudding is amazing. Oh, hey guys. Welcome back to this episode. I'm super excited that you're here. Thanks for tuning in. I was just eating a little bit of low-carb pudding that my wife, Deanna, she's over at Real Food Lab on Instagram. It's an amazing coconut pudding here. It's Friday night. All right, so let's talk about the podcast. This is going to be an awesome discussion all about the different ways and the mechanisms through which our diet and inactivity or activity, how that affects our body's response to insulin, our blood sugar control, and our ability to either burn or store fat for fuel, which is really, really fascinating. So, oftentimes we focus a lot on diet, and diet is so important, but Ted's gonna really talk about physical activity and other lifestyle factors that modulate your body's insulin response. And the crosstalk, this is what's key. The crosstalk between your muscle tissue and your fat tissue, and how the activity or the macronutrient combinations within your diet, how that affects your fat cell metabolism. It's super, super exciting. I really hope you enjoy it. Along the lines of physical activity, I want to give a shout out to our show sponsor, Health IQ. They're a progressive life insurance company, and I love their approach. They take science and data and meld the two together and help health conscious people like you and I, people that lift weights, that hike, that do yoga, that if we eat a low carb ketogenic style diet, if we focus on our microbiome, guess what? We improve our health and our vitality, and Health IQ will reward you for that by helping you save up to 33% on your life insurance premiums. Life insurance, as you know, is so important. If you have dependents, a spouse, kids, and so forth, and something were to happen to you and you didn't have life insurance, your family would be in a lot of trouble. So you can get a free quote and see if you qualify, but go on to healthiq.com/HIH. Again, that's healthiq.com/HIH. Now, last but not least, there's another aspect of the podcast that we really don't talk about, but it's sleep. Sleep is so important to your body's blood sugar regulation, leptin, insulin sensitivity, cortisol, and much more. But it's not just about sleep quantity, it's about sleep quality. As you know, I'm a huge fan of mouth taping because mouth taping can help improve your dream recall, your sleep quality, your deep sleep, and your REM scores if you use an Oura Ring or other sleep tracking devices. That's why I'm a huge fan of the SomniFix mouth tape. You see, if you breathe through your mouth while you're sleeping, your tongue can actually collapse on the airway and cause a mild hypoxic type event. So it's very important to practice mouth taping because that helps your body relearn how to breathe through your nose, which can help you get that deep restorative sleep and help you really recover and have optimal energy, performance, and blood sugar regulation, and not experience the ebb and flow of blood sugar and food cravings throughout the day. So SomniFix is a show sponsor as well. Please check out their product. I'll put it in the show notes below. It's absolutely fantastic. I've had so many people message me and comment on this blog and on my Instagram saying they absolutely love it and enjoy it. And I suspect you will too. The key aspect of the SomniFix mouth tape compared to other tapes out there is it uses a hypoallergenic adhesive that doesn't make the practice of mouth taping uncomfortable, and you don't wake up peeling off this really strong adhesive and causing skin irritations and all that. So that is all I have for you guys. I really, really hope you enjoy this podcast. If you do, please give it a thumbs up, share it with friends and family, and I'll be watching the comments as the video gets posted. So let's dive into it with Dr. Ted Naiman. Hello friends, it's Mike Mutzel. Thanks so much for tuning back into another episode. I'm really excited to be here with Dr. Ted Naiman. Today we're going to talk about insulin resistance, protein, fat cells, and all kinds of stuff in between. I'm very excited to be with you. Thanks for showing up and being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Wow, we're neighbors.
We are, yes.
Yeah.
So we're in Kirkland right now. You're in Issaquah.
Correct.
Not too far away.
Not too far away.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, I'm local.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's really great when we can actually have someone local in the Northwest be here, so it's just a lot easier. So let's kind of launch with insulin. I think that's a big area that you've been helping us to better understand insulin resistance and so forth. And this other component of insulin, how it kind of keeps us holding on to excess energy. right? And it's an element that we don't often talk about. We talk about how insulin makes us fat, but also how insulin can prevent us from burning fat for fuel.
Right. So insulin is a storage hormone, and the whole point of insulin is for you to hold on to stored energy. And that's why you see in patients with type 1 diabetes who have insulin deficiency, they just melt their whole body down into energy. They just get extremely lean and they lose all their lean mass into energy, basically. So insulin is there to store energy. It's an energy storage hormone.
Yeah. So I didn't know that. As a non-physician, we don't really, if you don't have a family member or loved one with type 1 diabetes, you don't really know that. So literally there's so much cachexia, like that anabolism component that insulin brings to the body is diminished. So like lean muscle mass just kind of withers away. They get really catabolic, eh?
Absolutely. So if you ever look in an old medical textbook at pictures of someone with type 1 diabetes before we developed insulin, they're just a walking skeleton. Basically, you just melt all your tissues down into energy, all your lean mass, protein, all your fat stores. It's just all converted into energy. And that's really one of the best ways to look at what insulin actually does, is to see what happens when somebody has none of it, or see what happens when somebody has way too much.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting about that explanation that you just offered us, which I think is really fascinating, is if we think about an insulin-resistant person, it's almost as though they're on the path of type 1 diabetes in the sense because the message is not being there because the receptors are resistant. So is that why we see like maybe sarcopenia and loss of lean muscle mass in insulin-resistant people as well?
I think that is part of why we do see some of those things in insulin resistance, yes. And then of course different tissues have different levels of insulin resistance. So you might be more resistant at the muscle, for example, than you are at the adipocyte.
Interesting. So on a more practical level, there's many ways that we can help to improve our body's receptors and become more insulin sensitive. You're a big fan of protein. You're a big fan of exercise, which I think we mutually agree, like you've got to be exercising, particularly compound movements and so on. What are some of the tools that you implement as a physician in the clinic to help people overcome this lifelong insulin resistance that they have?
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So the big problem with insulin resistance is you don't have any place to store fat, right? So people get insulin resistant when their fat cells are full. Your fat cells expand, and the larger your fat cells get, the higher your insulin level goes. You can graph out your fasting insulin level and the diameter of your fat cells, and it's just a straight line. So you overfill your fat cells, you have no place to put fat, and your insulin level's high all the time. So insulin's trying to store this fat, but it's really struggling, and that's where you get ectopic fat storage and things like that. Now the big question is, why did you overfill your fat cells, right? Like, did you eat too much fat? Well, actually you overfill your fat cells because you're eating carbohydrates, which displaces fat oxidation. So every cell in your body with mitochondria in it is constantly burning either glucose or fat reciprocally. You basically don't burn them at the exact same time. You do to a small degree, but there's constantly this fat versus glucose oxidation going on in your mitochondria and in your cells. And if you're eating glucose all the time, you displace fat oxidation, and then you're storing all your fat, right? So if I'm just eating carbs all day long, any fat that I ingest gets stored, and eventually you fill up your adipocytes, you run out of room, they're all distended. If you're genetically able to, you grow a bunch more fat cells and then you can be huge. If not, you gain 30 pounds and you stop and you can't get any fatter. Now you've hit your personal fat threshold. Now your insulin's high all the time. Now you have no place to put any fat. Well, you've got to either eat less fat, which is where we see people having some success with very low fat, high carb diets, or a better idea is eat less carbs, because that's what stopped you from oxidizing fat in the first place. So if you eat fewer carbohydrates, you can oxidize more fat, and then you've got more fat headroom in your adipocytes, you know what I mean?
Right. More leeway so I think a point here that's really kind of woven into what you were just talking about is the origin, or one origin, of insulin resistance, and that is dysfunctional adipocytes or fat cells.
Right.
And so I think there's so many different theories out there. Sleep issues, circadian rhythm imbalances, microbiome, gut hormones. But in your eyes as a physician, based upon the research that you've done, and you've really looked into this, it's those dang fat cells are getting too enlarged with excessive fats convert from carbohydrate, oxidation, and so forth, that is causing, fundamentally at the cell level, insulin resistance.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to just zoom way, way out and dumb it really down, insulin resistance is from overfilled fat cells, and you overfilled your fat cells because you were eating carbohydrates and fat at the same time. The carbohydrates, glucose always controls oxidation preference in your cells. So if glucose is present from the outside, you will oxidize less fat. So exogenous glucose coming in from the outside, shuts off fat oxidation. If you're eating fat at the same time, it all gets stored. So you just eat carbs and fat together like a donut all day, every day. You burn glucose all the time. You store fat all the time. Your adipocytes fill up. Bam, you've got hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. It's really that simple. So anything that you're looking at to reverse insulin resistance is going to be either oxidizing more fat, and you can do that by restricting glucose alone, works great. But so my main strategy is, how can you burn more fat and store less fat? And it's all about eating less glucose, less exogenous glucose coming in.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. I think this is a key point because we often don't talk about the fat cell and this idea that the fat cell gets enlarged, and that is a primary cause of insulin resistance. And there's a lot of research coming out about the different hormones and cytokines and adipocytokines released from these fat cells, adipocytes, like leptin and resistin and bisphatin and adiponectin and so forth. We were talking offline as a physician, you just like waist circumference as like your main biomarker, but are you looking, or in some patients, do you like to look at some of these, what we call adipocytokines released from fat cells?
I'm really not. No. I do track fasting insulin levels, but I'm not looking at adipokines. They're not really super helpful on a practical level.
Right. And if their waist, or if it looks like an apple, or if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it must be a duck, right? So let's talk about then the waist circumference. An easy strategy, easy tool that people at home they can go get a tape measure and look at height, waist circumference, and what does that tell them?
Right. So for most people, the circumference of the waist tracks with the size of the adipocytes and fasting insulin and insulin levels. There's a really good correlation between waist circumference and insulin levels and insulin sensitivity. So for your average person, you could look at a waist to height ratio and know pretty much where they're at in terms of insulin sensitivity. You basically measure your waist at the belly button, you divide it by your height. You really want to be less than 0.5. If you're higher than that, you're probably in trouble. And you can draw graphs of fasting insulin level versus waist to height ratio. It's very linear. You can graph out years of life lost and waist to height ratio, and it's exponential. So like the bigger you get, the faster you're just going to straight up die. It's very powerful number. I could replace half the lab tests I have with just a waist to height ratio. It's extremely powerful.
Quest and LabCorp would not like that.
They wouldn't like that. Yeah, it's kind of cheap. It's kind of low budget.
Right. We want to keep things really complicated and esoteric.
Right. Nobody can understand it.
Yeah.
Costs a lot.
Right. But there's I think a small caveat, correct me if I'm wrong, small caveat to that waist expansion and so forth like we were talking about, and this would be the quote unquote MONWA group, the metabolically obese normal weight individuals.
Right.
And you were saying let's maybe define that and talk about the trends that you've seen as a practitioner.
Well, I learned a lot about this from my patients with lipodystrophy. Lipodystrophy is this fascinating condition where you literally have no subcutaneous fat. And these people look thin. They actually look ripped. I have a patient with lipodystrophy who looks like a pro bodybuilder, but he just has no subcutaneous fat at all. And all of these people are horrifically insulin resistant. They're all diabetic. They're extremely brittle diabetics because when they ingest fat, they have no place to put it. Their insulin goes through the roof. So you're looking at people who are really, really lean, but the few fat cells they have are just massively distended. So one of my patients with lipodystrophy, for example, he had a few lipomas. I don't know if you know what a lipoma is, but it's a little fatty tumor. Some people will have a few of them. This patient, the only fat cells he had were a couple lipomas that grew to just like bowling ball size and had to be removed.
Wow.
And so basically you're massively overexpanding any fat cells you've got, and once they're full, you're insulin resistant. And all of these people have crazy high insulin levels. We did an amazing rat model study on lipodystrophy, where we took rats that were bred to be lipodystrophic, and we actually sewed fat underneath their skin and connected it to blood supply. So they now had some deflated fat cells in place to store fat, and immediately it cured their insulin resistance and diabetes, which basically proves that the adipocyte model of insulin resistance is true. I mean, you can look at lipodystrophy and the studies of these subcutaneous fat transplants in mice and really know all you need to know about the actual cause of insulin resistance. I mean, it is running out of places to store fat.
Wow, very interesting. So have they translated that animal model research to humans?
No, nobody's volunteered to get fat sewed under their skin if they're lipodystrophic, but I'm sure it would probably have the same effect.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So it may seem like a blessing in one sense, like, oh my gosh, you have no fat cells, right, so that you can stay lean, but there's a metabolic consequence or cost to that.
There's a huge metabolic cost to that, absolutely.
Yeah. And so that the patient that may look lean is actually metabolically obese. So they have that individual that looks ripped, that, like, if you were to look at their maybe coronary artery calcium score or other diseases, which we can kind of transition to, linked with elevated levels of insulin, it would be probably pretty high.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But that brings us to a really good point, the personal fat threshold. So everyone has this genetically built-in amount of fatness that they can achieve, right? As you get fatter, you can either have adipocyte hypertrophy, where you get bigger fat cells, or you can have adipocyte hyperplasia, where you grow more. And if you're someone who's genetically able to grow more fat cells, you could be 600 pounds and completely insulin sensitive. I have a patient who's 450 pounds, perfect insulin levels, very insulin sensitive, probably could just expand forever and be on, my 600-pound life or whatever that shows. And but other people, I have patients from Southeast Asia, for example, from India, and some of these locations, they'll gain just 10 pounds of fat, just a tiny amount of abdominal fat, and bam, they're horrifically insulin resistant. The second they overfill the one adipocyte they've got, they're diabetic instantly. Their insulin level goes through the roof. They're completely diabetic. They literally cannot get fatter. They've hit their personal fat threshold. And that's what hyperinsulinemia is. You hit your personal fat threshold, you can't get fatter, and now you've got, the next step is diabetes. And it's different for everybody. I don't think you can actually do much to change your personal fat threshold. That's the one caveat to waist to height ratio, of course, is if you have some sort of lipodystrophy where you can't get more subcutaneous fat.
Interesting. So ethnicity, genetics all play a big role here into this personal fat threshold.
Right.
Yeah. And you kind of explained indirectly the so-called obesity paradox that has kind of caused a lot of confusion amongst individuals. My brother-in-law is an interventional cardiologist, and so he'll see someone come in with chest pain and things like that and do a stent, and he would expect, based upon their body composition, that they would have really nasty occluded arteries, but they're squeaky clean. In contrast, the 56-year-old relatively lean male that is a smoker and so forth, their coronary arteries are a disaster. So we talk about this quite frequently. Do you see that in your practice too?
Absolutely. I mean, you'll see thinner people getting more Alzheimer's dementia. And so for a lot of people, getting fatter is protecting you from hyperinsulinemia and high blood sugar, high insulin, diabetes. As long as your fat cells can just suck up all the fat and glucose, you're actually protected a fair amount.
Interesting.
The problem is when you get this visceral fat, you've already filled up your subcutaneous fat. So the subcutaneous fat fills up first, really harmless, very protective, great stuff. But then when you run out of that, you fill up your visceral fat. Now you're in the hyperinsulinemia zone. And the next step is ectopic fat deposition, where you're just packing fat in anywhere you can. Your liver, your pancreas, your heart. I mean, you could have fat everywhere. Your muscles are full of fat. Everything's full of fat. You literally have no place to put any more fat.
So you're trying to stuff it. It's like you see those shows, the hoarders, people have just
Right.
boxes everywhere.
Exactly.
So that's what's going on literally with fat inside the body.
Once you've filled up your subcutaneous adipocytes. Yeah, absolutely.
As a physician, have you seen ultrasounds of people's liver or pancreas that have this ectopic lipid deposition?
Oh, all the time. I mean, we're just constantly doing CTs and MRIs and DEXAs and all sorts of imaging. And honestly, everybody has fatty liver now. Wow. Like, it used to be 25% of everyone who walked in the door had fatty liver. But now I'm trying to think back to when I ordered an abdominal ultrasound and the radiologist didn't report that they had fatty liver and I couldn't see fatty liver. It almost never happens at this point. It's quite ridiculous.
That is really scary. And so what are the metabolic consequences or physiologic consequences of that? And the reason why I'm asking this question is if we look at the ketones that everyone is chasing, they want to be ketogenic and so forth, we know that a lot of that is those ketones are made in the liver, right? So if you have all this fatty liver, are we able to metabolically function normally, or is the liver?
Not really, no. I mean, what ends up happening is you have a lot more free fatty acids in your blood, and none of your cells or tissues want that fat, and so your body starts to be at war with itself. Like, every tissue gets more and more insulin resistant because it doesn't want this stuff. And the cells are always looking out for themselves, right? So insulin is supposed to tell your cell to allow in more glucose and burn more glucose because you just ate a donut. But the cells don't want any more energy. They've already got too much fat. And so high insulin is really just a war between your body and your cells and different tissue types. It's like musical chairs, right? None of your cells want any more energy. They've got too much. It's already probably damaging your mitochondria. They don't want more fat. They don't want more glucose. They really don't want more glucose. And so you just see these levels in the blood getting higher and higher, and none of the tissues or cells in your body want it at all. And that's when your insulin's high all the time.
Right. And so for people listening right now, they might be thinking like, well, they're talking about fat a lot, fat cells having too much fat. Then why would a high-fat diet help me? So help us kind of grapple with that. And
well, actually, okay, so I'm a low-carb guy, right? And I'm going to take some hate mail from the low-carb community for saying this. But you can actually reverse insulin resistance by eating either a low-fat diet or a low-carb diet. And we have studies that completely prove this. I mean, we have studies where they randomize people to an extremely low-fat, high-carb diet or an extremely high-fat, low-carb diet, and both groups reverse insulin resistance exactly the same. Waist circumference comes down, insulin comes down, all the markers you're looking at come down. Why do I prefer low-carb? Well, I think it's better for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it makes way more sense from an evolutionary perspective. So if you look at what humans are supposed to eat, I mean, I really don't think that we were supposed to eat a very high carb, low fat diet. That's very hard to find if I just drop you off in the wilderness, you know what I mean? So the other thing is people who are oxidizing more glucose and less carbs are just metabolically less healthy. So we have a lot of studies on metabolic health, and you really want your respiratory quotient to be as low as possible. That's how much fat you're burning when you're just sitting around versus glucose. So I think it's healthier to burn fat instead of glucose. People who are burning fat instead of glucose are much less hungry, much less tied to food. They can exercise in a fasted state. They can go a lot longer without eating. I think it's the way the human body is designed to function. I think you're supposed to mostly run off of fat. I think you're supposed to be in a fasted state the majority of the time, running off of fat, and then you refuel by eating something. So I like the low carb, high fat approach. But the point is that you can reverse insulin resistance with a low fat, high carb approach. And the idea here is that the real problem is eating fat and carbs together, because fat and glucose are oxidized reciprocally. So if you eat one or the other, you're going to be okay, right? So let's say I eat just tons of carbs, right? Yes, my glucose is present. I'm burning a lot of glucose, which means I shut off fat oxidation and any fat that I'm eating will get stored. But if I don't eat any fat, I'm not really storing anything. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm following you. The one comment that I would say that's kind of causing a mental some conflict mentally is this idea that if we eat carbohydrates, then we spike insulin as well, and that promotes lipogenesis. So help us understand that.
Well, okay, so that's a great point. And in fact, if you're fat to begin with, you should do the low carb, high fat approach, right? Okay. Because you want to be burning fat. You have a lot of extra fat on your body. You want to be really good at burning fat. So you avoid eating carbohydrates, glucose-producing digestible carbs, so there's no exogenous glucose coming in from the outside, which frees you up to just burn fat all the time. And you seamlessly go from dietary fat to stored body fat, and now you're going to lose a bunch of weight. And that's why low-carb diets are way, way better for anyone who's overweight. Mm-hmm. But if you are already thin to begin with, like some sort of hyper-vegan, and you have very low body fat, if you eat a high-carb, low-fat diet, you will remain thin, because while you're displacing all your fat oxidation with glucose from carbs, you're not eating any fat, so you're not storing any fat. So that's why we have these studies where insulin sensitive people do just fine on a high carb, low fat diet. Well, the truth is they do just fine on a low carb, high fat diet as well. But when you look at people who already have too much fat in their body, they definitely do better on a low carb diet. And so I like, honestly, low carb for everybody. Mm-hmm. But I do respect the fact that you can reverse insulin resistance by either eating less carbs or eating less fat. And my personal favorite, both. Mm-hmm. Which brings us to protein. I mean, if you're not eating extra fat because you have too much fat in your body, and you're not eating carbs because it displaces fat oxidation, what are you eating? And that's protein. And my favorite diet for someone who's very overweight and very insulin resistant is protein heavy.
A lot of the keto people are kind of scared about protein because it's gluconeogenic and it spikes insulin. So let's talk about that.
Right. So I'm not talking about large absolute amounts of protein. I'm talking about high percentage of protein. Mm-hmm. Basically, you go out of your way to target protein and eat enough protein for satiety, but then you're restricting carbohydrates so you can burn fat. And you're also restricting some fat because you have too much fat on your body. And this seems to be the very fastest way to reverse insulin resistance. I mean, we know this from studies on protein-sparing modified fast. That's where you're basically just eating protein. It is the fastest way to reverse insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm. And some people would say, well, if you're just eating protein, then you're probably not consuming enough calories. So that's the reason why you're losing weight, because the whole calorie argument gets so interconnected and it kind of complicates everything. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, I guess that's true. And in fact, fasting, you'll lose a lot of weight. The problem with fasting or under eating calories is that you're going to lose just as much lean mass as fat mass. So if I just stop eating, or if I eat the standard American diet, 60% carbohydrates, and just eat a tiny bit of it, like I eat one Twinkie a day, half my weight loss is going to be muscle loss, lean loss. Nobody wants to lose weight. Everyone wants to lose fat. You don't want to lose weight. You want to lose fat. Mm-hmm. If you are eating more than adequate protein and restricting carbs and maybe restricting some fat as well, all of your weight loss is going to be pure fat.
Right. Like
very, very high percent just fat. But if you just undereat, if you're like, okay, I'll still eat just the McDonald's shake and fries, but I'm just gonna eat one fry and one shake. Like everyone's doing these diet experiments now where they just eat junk food, but they shrink the calories down. Well, that's great, you'll lose a lot of weight, but half of that weight will be lean mass, and your body composition is just gonna suck. Right. So that's why macros are so important, and that's why you want to prioritize protein. That's why you want to eat more protein and less energy by percentage. I'm not saying absolute protein. I don't want anyone to eat 400 grams of protein a day.
Right. Yeah, I would love to dive into the specifics, but maybe let's knock out some of the nuances a little bit more. This protein leverage theory you were talking about, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, because it's not something I know much about. And that's something you've been diving into quite a bit, and I think it's a new conversation, new narrative around protein that people need to understand.
Definitely. So protein leverage hypothesis, this is something we've proven in animal models over and over. Basically, every species has to navigate between protein and energy, right? And so if you give an animal a food that's pure protein and a food that's pure energy, carb or fat, they will eat a little bit of one and a little bit of the other, and between the two get to their exact ratio that they need for optimum function, right? You can do this with any animal, from fruit flies to locusts to primates to slime molds. You offer them different foods with varying amounts of protein and energy, and they will always kind of go the direction that's optimum for them, either for reproduction or function or both. Humans have the exact same thing, and humans have this very, very strong protein satiety drive. Like, we have to eat a certain amount of protein, and we have proven in studies that if you don't hit this protein target, you will overeat energy, that's carbs or fats. So we know that protein leverage is real, and we know that humans will overeat energy to get enough protein. That's our rule of compromise. If we can't get enough protein in our diet, we'll overeat energy to get there. And that's what you see happening in society today. I mean, everyone likes to either blame, some people like to blame carbs for the obesity epidemic, right? Look at all the refined carbs, sugar and flour. Yes, that's true. We have way more carbs. Other people blame fat. Look at all the vegetable oil. Look at all the soybean oil. The reality is, if you graph out the macros that have flooded the food supply over the past 100 or 200 years, you do see carbs going way up. You also see fat going up. What you don't see going up is protein, which has stayed pretty flat. Now, everyone's ignored protein up to this point for that reason. They're like, oh, we're all eating so much carbs, or no, we're all eating so much fat. Has to be carbs or fat. In the background, protein has stayed, most humans in all cultures and all societies across the world have stayed at this very rigid 14% protein diet, like everywhere. Mm-hmm. But if you really, really look at the food supply in our country, we went down in percentage. So our protein intake went from 14% to 12.5%. And so now we have protein dilution. It means that we've flooded the food supply with carbs and fats, these empty calorie carbs and fats, sugar, flour, oil, which is every processed packaged food you can think of. Protein got diluted. Now, to eat the same amount of protein, you have to eat more. The studies show that for every 1% of protein that goes down in your food supply, you have to eat 14% more of that food to get where your body wants to be. Mm-hmm. So we dilute protein, and then people overeat carbs and fats as a result. And you really can't explain most of the obesity and diabetes epidemic with protein dilution. If you look way, way back, we didn't have as much energy to eat. We were very protein constrained, you know what I mean? If you ate animals, but maybe you didn't get plant sugars in the winter time, or maybe you didn't get really, really fat animals that had been fed grain. So you're eating leaner animals and you're getting a lot of protein, but maybe you're not getting a lot of energy. Mm-hmm. So humans crave energy. We love to add energy because we've been protein constrained for so long. So humans are always seeking out, honey or fat or something to add energy to our protein, because you can't eat a really, really high percent of protein. So that's what's going on in the background. It's like we were always protein constrained. We're always looking for energy. Now we've got tons of energy. We've dumped all this energy into the food supply. Protein percent went down, and we're all eating more as a result.
So our operating system hasn't been updated, and so we're kind of seeking out this protein, and in so doing, we're eating a lot more energy from non-protein sources, trying to get the protein. Is that kind of the
right? So like if I give you a low protein food like French fries, it's 5%, 10% protein. You have to massively overeat the carbs and fat in French fries to get to your protein target, and that's just how it works.
Right, and so that's why some people, I hear this a lot from clients of mine in our e-courses and stuff like that. They say, I just have these cravings, like I just crave, and they end up eating cookies or junk food or gluten-free treats, whatever it is, and so that's why they're still overweight. But that protein is also very satiating, so is that part of it as well, the satiety-inducing effect of the protein?
That's part of it as well, and it's interesting about the cravings that we have studies that show that if you protein restrict someone, their snacking and craving for savory snacks goes way up because you're just trying to get this umami flavor. This indicates protein coming into your body. And so, yeah, absolutely, that's you will continue to eat nonstop until you get this protein satiety.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about vegetarians and vegans. We were talking offline, you know, that's part of the reason why you got into this is because you were relatively, in your own words, unhealthy when you were a vegetarian. What can we do about those diets? Because those individuals, for philosophical reasons, whatever, like I told you, I'm eating a little bit less protein because I have the chickens, I'm more empathetic towards animals. What are some of the consequences there for that group, and how can they correct it? Because you have a lot of patients, in your own words, that can do this healthily, you know, because they're getting other protein sources.
Right. Well, in the plant world, there's also higher and lower protein foods. So grains, sugars, starches, horrifically low protein, high energy, basically crap. But if you look at green vegetables, very high in protein. The protein to energy ratio is actually quite high. Any kind of green vegetable, high protein to energy ratio. Mushrooms, high protein to energy ratio. Soy, I don't need a lot of soy, but it does have a high protein to energy ratio. You can also, for vegetarians, I think that you want to prioritize the few animal foods you do eat, like eggs or dairy. Cottage cheese is great, eggs are great. For vegans, it's a little bit more difficult, I think, to get adequate protein. And some of the more successful vegan patients I have are doing some sort of supplementation. In addition to B12 supplements and other, crucial supplements, they are using protein powders, for example. So that's one strategy. But the less processed and refined your diet is, of course, the higher the protein to energy ratio you're going to have. So you can always just eat cleaner, and that seems to help by itself.
Seems to work, yeah. You've studied ancestral diets and diets throughout populations and things like that. Are there any populations that you've found or researched or talking with people? I know you spent a lot of time recently with Gary Taubes and stuff like that eat primarily a vegan diet, that are unindustrialized and so forth.
Well, it's interesting. I've been doing a lot of research into this, and you can look at populations on Earth and what their carb to fat ratio is, and it's radically different. Like in Japan, they eat way more carbs and way less fat than we do. And here we eat way more fat than other countries, and so there are these huge swings in carb fat ratio, but the protein ratio is like laser focused across every society on Earth. Like the skew between protein to energy ratios is tiny, and then the carb fat swing is really, really big. So that's just one more reason for me that I think protein might be a bigger piece of the puzzle that nobody's realizing, because we're like, oh wow, these Okinawans eat all these carbs, and here we all this fat, and then what about the French, and we have all these paradoxes. But if you really look at protein, it's pretty conserved across all these groups, and you'll see tiny changes in protein driving huge swings in obesity and intake, and it's pretty dramatic. There's a lot to it.
Right. We were talking before we started recording about some of the fear in the keto world about protein, that it spikes insulin, that it's gluconeogenic, so it's going to raise your blood glucose, kick you out of ketosis, all that sort of stuff. But you mentioned yourself, you're like, well, I get my energy for lifting weights and doing pull-ups and all this from the gluconeogenesis, from the protein and so forth. So what would you say to those folks that are pretty scared about protein?
I think that you really want to get to ketosis with carb restriction. You know what I mean? Yeah. And for most people, that will get you there, even if you're eating a lot of protein. So you could eat a 35% protein diet that's pretty much equal grams of fat and protein, right? Let's say you're eating eggs. It's 6 grams of protein, 7 grams of fat. Or steak. It's 22 grams of protein, 22 grams of fat. These are 1-to-1 grams protein and fat foods. You're eating about 35% protein. You're going to be in ketosis all the time when you eat these foods. We have studies on very low carb, high protein diets. The participants in these studies ate 35% protein, pretty much equal grams protein and fat, really low carbs. they're in ketosis at all times. They're in, it might be not the deepest ketosis you've ever seen that you get from just fasting and eating nothing but coconut oil.
Yeah.
But they're in ketosis. They're constantly in ketosis. I'm in ketosis regularly, even though protein for me is either 1-to-1 with fat or the dominant macro. Sometimes I'll eat 2 grams of protein for every 1 gram of fat, which is basically the macros of ground beef or meat or poultry or your average animal food is 2 grams of protein to 1 gram of fat, and you can be in ketosis just eating that. It might be a lighter ketosis, but you don't have to feel, everyone thinks, oh, I ate too much protein, I get kicked out of ketosis, or I get pulled out of ketosis, and there are all these verbs for how protein just completely shut off your ketosis. And that's crap. You can actually eat a ton of protein and be ketogenic. You could eat nothing and be in ketosis. You could eat nothing but carbs, but a really tiny amount and be in ketosis. You could just do a ton of exercise and be in ketosis. There are so many other ways to be generating ketones besides restricting protein. I just don't think that that's the way to do it.
Right, because there may be other consequences associated with that.
Right,
Yeah.
like, honestly, muscle is so important, like so important. Muscle is the organ of longevity. I mean, you have to have muscle. You can look at how strong someone is and how long they're gonna live, and it's just a straight line. You always want to have the highest lean mass you can pull off with the lowest fat mass. I mean, let's face it, that's the goal. And you want the lowest fat mass because that's going to give you the very lowest insulin levels, the very most insulin sensitivity. You're going to have plenty of place to put fat, so insulin's low all the time. So your whole goal in life is to max out that lean mass and minimize the fat mass. And it's really about eating protein and a higher protein to energy ratio.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%, but there are some people that talk, like Ron Rosedale and others, that look at the link between mTOR stimulation, which is stimulated with protein and so forth, and also exercise, and higher prevalences of cancer. So what would you say, you mentioned, and I love that aphorism or quote, whatever, that muscle is the organ of longevity, but then if we also look at cancer, it's a disease associated with aging, and then we have this in between, this growth factor called mTOR for stimulating that with protein. Are we increasing a risk for cancer? Like, I have a friend, I was just texting with him last night, we were like grappling with this mentally.
All right.
Help us add some clarity there.
Oh, sure. Okay, the whole secret to all of this is to keep it pulsatile, right? So like insulin's bad, you never want to eat anything to raise insulin. Well, insulin goes up every time you eat. Insulin goes up if you eat just fat. Insulin goes up if you eat protein. So the secret to insulin is to keep it pulsatile. You're fasting, your insulin's really low, you're running off of stored body fat, insulin's just barely detectable, and then you eat a giant meal, it goes way up, big spike of insulin, you store the fat. It's the way your body's supposed to work, right? You're basically battery powered. Your body's running off a chemical battery, and you're supposed to run on battery power for a long time and then eat a whole bunch of stuff and refill your battery, not overfill it, but refill it, and then you're good to go for another period of time. In this setting, insulin is not bad. Insulin is great. Insulin's awesome. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You want it to spike. You want fasting and feasting. You want this pulsatile insulin. Really low for a long time, super high, back down to low. You want to do the same thing with mTOR. You want these fasting and feasting cycles, right? You don't want to just drink 6 protein shakes a day like a bodybuilder and then die I think they all die of liver cancer or something.
Yeah.
No, you don't want to do that. You want to keep mTOR pulsatile. You don't want to eat constantly. You want to have these fasting and feasting cycles. And I really think that's the secret. I don't think you want to restrict protein all the time so mTOR never gets triggered just the way you want it. Never eat anything all the time so your insulin never goes up. You want to have these clear pulsatile messages, and I think that's the secret. I think that's why mTOR looks like it's going to give people cancer, but it really doesn't if you're triggering it appropriately.
And within its normal physiologic levels, like you were saying, because if you're constantly having mTOR stimulated from protein shakes and snacking and inactivity and so forth, inactivity wouldn't raise it, but you know what I'm saying, then that would be super physiologic levels of this growth stimulus. Whereas if we're eating like you're saying, adding in the element that was tacitly implied that you practice of time-restricted feeding, aka intermittent fasting, then we're keeping things, the valleys and troughs where they should be.
Right.
Physiologically.
Yeah, and I think that, looking at it through an evolutionary lens, I'm pretty sure that's how it was supposed to work,
Yeah. Awesome. Gosh, we've covered so much here. But one thing that we didn't cover that we were talking about offline that I think is important is brown adipose tissue. And the heat's not on in this home. It's fall here in Seattle. It's starting to get a little cold, and we're both in agreement that 2 thumbs up for that, because the link between elevated house temperature correlates with body fat. And I know we talked about subcutaneous and visceral fat. Brown fat is emerging in humans. We've had a lot of animal data. What are your thoughts on brown fat, house temperature, and being cold?
Yeah, I mean, it's really sad, but ambient temperature is a huge factor for diabetes. You can look at latitudes on Earth, and the closer you are to the equator, the higher your diabetes risk. So the reality is, if you're cold all the time, you're going to get way more mitochondria in your fat cells. Just like if you're lifting weights all the time, you're going to get way more mitochondria in your muscle cells. And the more mitochondria you can get, the better. And the way you get mitochondria is you have to have a transient energy crisis in your cells of some kind, right? So you lift weights to failure, you add more mitochondria in your muscle. You're freezing your butt off, you add more mitochondria to your fat. Both of these involve a level of discomfort that nobody wants to be uncomfortable, right? Everyone never wants to be cold or feel the discomfort of high intensity exercise, but you really want to push yourself out of that comfort zone. You want to be cold a lot. You want to hit muscle failure a lot. You want your body to struggle. You want to have these transient energy crises in your body where your body's like, oh my God, we can't get warm enough, or we can't lift this super heavy boulder. And only then will your body make itself better. You get more mitochondria, fat, muscle, hopefully both. So I love thermal loading. I love being a little bit cold all the time. My house is kind of cold too, so yeah, good for you. That's perfect. And I think it's hard for some people to do this because it's human nature to never be uncomfortable. But you really have to push yourself out of that comfort zone.
Right. I found that with high achievers, successful people like yourself, that they're always pushing the boundaries. People that live within their comfort zone, whether it's work, family life, physiology, like we're talking about here, staying lean, they don't really hit that. And so what, I just personally am interested in like the characteristics behind that. What in your upbringing, childhood, where you were raised, or where does that come from for you? You'd say like always pushing the envelope, whether it's the weight training, music, going to med school, engineering, like you've done a lot of things to push yourself that are maybe uncomfortable.
Honestly, I think it's from seeing patients. Okay, so if you look at the healthiest person who ever walks in the door at my clinic, like they look like they're carved from solid granite, some sort of fire-breathing CrossFitter who's just completely ripped and the healthiest person you've ever seen. And then you look at the most decrepit human specimen you've ever seen. They shuffle in, or maybe they're in a wheelchair, they have a sarcopenia, osteopenia, they look awful. Really, the only difference between these two people is diet and exercise, like honestly. And what happens to turn someone into the human zombie sarcopenia, osteopenia person is they never, ever push themselves into any kind of discomfort. They just sit on the couch their whole life. They don't do any kind of even movements that are even slightly uncomfortable. You'll see them sitting in a position of least energy, like literally where they don't have to activate any muscle in their body. The temperature always has to be perfect for them. They barely move. They never push themselves to do anything difficult or exertional. Every bit of glucose that they're running their body off of, they ingest instead of making their own glucose the hard way via gluconeogenesis out of protein like your ancestors did, right? So on one hand, you've got someone who's restricting carbs, making all their glucose the hard way in their liver out of gluconeogenesis. They're lifting weights, they're Their posture is awesome. They're always they're always making their body work harder, right, to produce energy and to be stronger and to do more and to go more. And versus someone who's just basically lived in this tiny little comfort bubble and just never pushed outside of that. And the health implications are just enormous. Like, it's just absolutely ridiculous, which is why I'm constantly trying to, you'll see me doing body weight exercises when I'm just like in the park, or, I'm always trying to make things a little bit harder for my body. Thermal loading, body weight exercises, making all my glucose from scratch the hard way out of protein. These are all really, really good strategies, but they all involve discomfort, and it's just a lot of work. You know what I mean? It's easier to just lay in bed and just atrophy your whole body down to nothing.
Right, and just hit Uber Eats and have food delivered and
right.
stuff like that.
Exactly.
So, I mean, as a practitioner, when you're working with a patient like that, and mentally maybe they're not even ready to take the steps that you want them to do to make those lifestyle shifts, what would be like the biggest piece of low-hanging fruit for that person?
Well, I mean, I think diet is the biggest, right? So it's always start with diet, and it's basically one meal at a time, replace your carbs with protein. So like breakfast, eat some eggs, you know what I mean? And that's how you start. It's like pick one meal, trade your carbs in for protein. It's difficult for people to not eat glucose if they're used to just running everything off of glucose. It's kind of painful. You hear about the keto flu. It's an uphill battle. Metabolically switching over and making your own glucose and running off of fat when you're not used to it is a lot more work. It's basically the metabolic equivalent of exercise, of CrossFit or something.
Right.
So I like to start with a diet. It's one meal at a time. You usually start with breakfast, and you just trade out your carbs for protein and fat. So you're eating, steak and eggs instead of breakfast cereal. So I like to nail the diet first, one meal at a time, drag people kicking and screaming into it. And only after you've got that nailed, I think, can you really dive into exercise. But once people get a little bit of success, sometimes you see it snowball. And these people come back in a year later and you can't even recognize them. And they're just like a fitness model, And
they're doing all kinds of different things.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it just grows from there. And now you're pushing yourself to do all sorts of insane stuff.
So it seems to me that you need a few small wins, and then people realize, like, wow, I do feel better. And then they need that internal that's how they garner this intrinsic motivation, is a little success, where maybe they didn't have any success from sitting on the couch and eating whatever. So Sandy Sweeney, past podcast guest, talked a lot about that, about when it comes, she's a well-known fitness instructor, group fitness instructor, and I was like, what separates the people that just are here 6 a.m, whether it's, the day before New Year's Eve or whatever, they're training, and she's like, you know what, they're the ones who feel that success, and then that like sparks an internal motivation.
All right.
And you just really kind of said that in a totally different perspective, which is awesome. So we know having small wins in the day can really kickstart internal motivation and so forth, and successful people, practitioners, physicians like yourself have kind of a set of rituals and things they do in the morning. Let's talk about your morning. Like, what do you do when you first get up, breakfast, all that good stuff?
Oh, wow. So I don't really have a morning ritual. I mean, I feel like if I was a real biohacker, I would meditate for 90 minutes and I would make a list of stuff. And I really don't have that luxury because I'm seeing my first patient at 7:30. So my day just hits the ground running. I do fast in the morning. I usually don't eat till about 1 in the afternoon. So my only morning ritual is just enough coffee to stay alive and then go straight to work. Nice. So I don't have any sort of great biohacking routine in the morning. It's just basically survival, black coffee, and go straight to work.
So no fatty coffee, bulletproof, just straight black. That's
I might put a little half and half in if it's super bitter. It depends on what I made or where I got it. Cool. But it's typically cold brew black because it's less bitter and I could just drink it black like that.
Nice. You make it at home or do you buy the... Okay. Yeah, my wife loves that. It's got a nice caffeine kick to it, the cold brew.
Right. Cold brew is where it's at.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can drink it black, lots of caffeine. What's not to love?
Yeah, love it. Speaking of, so your morning routine, let's talk about if there's just one exercise you could do, only one for the rest of your life, what would it be and why?
Muscle up. Muscle up. Probably the best upper body exercise. I mean, it basically hits everything. you've got pulling and pushing in the same movement. You know, you have to do both to do a muscle up. It's probably the single greatest upper body exercise if you could only choose one.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, how much rest in between? I mean, days, what I'm referring to, because a lot of people would get stuck in this upper body push, lower body push, upper body pull, and do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, etc. Would you do back-to-back muscle up training days, or?
So, okay, you know how there's intensity, frequency, and volume?
Yeah.
It's kind of like this little triangle, you know, intensity, frequency, volume. I love the intensity side of that triangle. I think that's the absolute most important. I think if you really go to failure and just max out the intensity, you can let the other two slide quite a bit. I have patients who do a really high intensity training, maybe once a week or even every 2 weeks, and they're growing muscle or maintaining. So intensity is number one, and I always bring the intensity because let's face it, if you're gonna do an exercise and you're not maxing out the intensity, you're just leaving money on the table, right?
Yeah.
The second one I like is frequency. I think that if I don't exercise a muscle group at least every 48 hours, I basically start going a little bit backwards. So I like really, really brief, high intensity workouts, maybe even as frequently as daily or every other day.
Cool.
So I aim for at least 3 times a week, every muscle group, full body, high intensity, but really low volumes. And actually recently I've been experimenting with single set to failure daily, like a really low volume, but just working daily. And a lot of people are afraid that, you know, maybe they'll start going backwards. And I really don't think that's true if the volume is low. So, you know, you can do a single set to failure in like 60 seconds. And
Yeah.
as long as you stop there and the volume's low, you're not just crushing yourself. I think intensity's the best, frequency's second. Volume, you might not want to overdo it because there's definitely such a thing as too much volume. So I honestly try to do a single set of body weight exercises to failure every day.
That's so awesome. And then, but you're also having the amino acids and the protein to help with the recovery, so it kind of brings this whole conversation full circle.
Right.
Which is really great. That's fantastic. Okay, I know you're not a big supplement guy, but if there's one, whether whole food, herb nutrient, just some botanical, some supplement that you just couldn't live without, what would it be and why?
Yeah, I take no supplements at all. I rarely recommend them. I'm trying to do it with food. I think most people can.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have a really favorite supplement. You know, even vitamin D, I much prefer people go outside. Vitamin D is a great example. Everyone's deficient in vitamin D. Low vitamin D is associated with every bad thing you can think of. I mean, Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis and diabetes and obesity, and everything bad is associated with low vitamin D. But we've never proven that taking vitamin D prevents or reverses any of that crap. Low vitamin D is just a sign that your health sucks somehow, you know what I mean? So it's not like taking vitamin D is really going to fix that necessarily. And there might even be other phytonutrients that we don't know of in addition to vitamin D, so it's always better if you could just go outside and get some sun, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it's kind of the same story with supplements and food. I think you're always better off getting it from food. I don't have a one killer supplement that I couldn't live without. I almost never take them, and I rarely recommend them.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's brilliant. I mean, you can't compensate for lack of sunshine with 4,000 IUs of vitamin D a day.
You can't
There's
do it.
so many different components and factors. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's brilliant advice. Sachin Patel, who's been on the podcast before, has talked a lot about that. And he said, in his words, he said the natural tendency is to just, if someone's low in vitamin D, to give them vitamin D, but where they really need, as you said, sunshine.
Right.
You know, so great advice. So if you were in an elevator with a politician, parliament member from another country, they turned to you and said, Dr. Naiman, you know a lot about metabolism, nutrition. In 30 seconds, what's the biggest thing, the biggest impact that I can have as a policymaker to help the people that I'm trying to regulate and improve the community's health? What would you say to them and why?
I would say reverse protein dilution. You know, everyone's eating all these carbs and fats together. This is basically obesogenic rat chow. and we're all, fat as hell. And you have to reverse that. People have to prioritize protein. They have to eat protein first. Protein's the most expensive. And so there's a huge economic factor there. Like, you can graph out poverty locations and obesity locations and superimpose them, and it's exactly the same. It's because protein's the most expensive. You can look at every food in the grocery store and price it by how much protein is in it, and it's just perfectly linear. Yeah. Protein's the most expensive. Protein's the hardest to get. Protein's the least profit for companies. Everyone's under eating protein dilution. Now we're all fat.
Mm-hmm. So is that kind of a contrast to that, or something like that? The naysayers, or even myself, we would say something along the lines that, well, companies like Tyson and all the GMO food that's fed to animals, that's just kind of reinforcing that whole factory farm model. What would be the counter argument to that?
Right, and I do think factory farms are terrible. I think that's bad for everybody, the people, the animals, the environment. We have to do it right. Yeah. And I think, honestly, the way to go is ruminant agriculture. I mean, one cow can feed one human for a whole year, powered by nothing but ambient sunlight and rainfall. I mean, that's powerful. That's huge. Yeah. You take a cow, add ambient sunlight and rainfall, and you fed a human for a year. Right. With a very high protein, very nutritious diet. We have to do it the right way with ruminant agriculture raised on grassland. Ruminants convert cellulose, which is unusable by other animals and humans. Nobody's competing for it. It's just covering 80% of the land mass of the planet. They convert this cellulose that nobody can use into really high quality nutrition for free, using ambient sunlight and rainfall, and actually sequestering carbon in the soil and making topsoil. So they're better than carbon neutral. That's how it's done.
Right.
We need better ruminant agriculture on just natural grasslands, and that would turn so much stuff around. I mean, that would turn around obesity and diabetes. That would help the environment. I mean, we'd use way less fossil fuels because we're basically eating oil for fertilizer right now.
Yeah.
Monocropping is dead. Factory farming is awful. Give me some grass-fed beef.
Mm-hmm. And so you encourage your patients to find a local farm, grass-fed, in the Northwest. We're very fortunate.
We're lucky.
Yeah.
We've got it everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've got like wild-caught salmon and grass-fed beef as far as the eye can see, so we're very lucky. But yeah, that's where it's at.
Mm-hmm. Except for there's a little snafu with the salmon. Did you hear about that? Where the Atlantic salmon that were farmed.
Oh, yeah.
400,000 Atlantic salmon just migrated into Puget Sound.
Details.
Yeah, who cares?
Could be important.
Scary stuff out there. Well, Dr. Naiman, really appreciate you coming on the show. This is
absolutely
thanks
fantastic.
For
having me, man. Absolutely.
And so we connected on Twitter, and that's how we got to know each other and so forth, and connected for this interview. So if folks want to connect with you, what's the best online resource for that?
Probably Twitter, or I've got a website, Burn Fat Not Sugar.
Cool. And you have your lectures and so forth are posted there, so you have quite a few really good lectures on YouTube as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Awesome. All right, guys, I really appreciate you tuning in. Thanks for listening all the way through. If you want to connect with Dr. Ted, please click the YouTube description below, and I'll put the show notes there as well. Have a good one.